coming this morning to this fantastic event, which we're delighted to do in partnership with Charities Aid Foundation, which is celebrating its 100th year at the moment.
That's right.
Fantastic organisation, which Neil Heslop, their Chief Executive, will talk more about, but a great contributor to civil society, and New Philanthropy Capital, which is the think tank, the great think and do tank of the voluntary sector and civil society, and does some fantastic work bringing together data and evidence and impact to try and drive better outcomes in the sector. So we're delighted to partner with these two organisations to talk about places to be proud of, how philanthropy and government support communities and tackle regional inequality. And I'm Andrew O'Brien, Director of Policy at Demos, which is an independent cross-party think tank. And we've been around about 30 years. Dan, you were probably involved in some shenanigans when it started.
Jeff Morgan.
Indeed. You didn't even say Jeff Morgan, and everybody instantly kind of bends down and prays. So delightful to have this distinguished panel here. Emily Darlington, Member of Parliament for Milton Keynes Central, who is great. Thank you so much for coming here, because we know how busy your schedule is. Neil Heslop, OBE, who's Chief Executive of Charity Aid Foundation. Sunder, Katwala, Director of British Future, who's written a fantastic book, which I was pleased to read last year on how to be a patriot, which I thoroughly recommend you all buy, and has some, I'm sure, bits you'll be cribbing from for your comments today. And Dan Corry, who is the soon to be departing Chief Executive of New Philanthropy Capital, but has been a great servant to our sector. I just thought I'd begin the session, before I hand over to Emily to say a few words, just with a quote which I always turn to in conversations, particularly around Labour and the sector, and a chocolate bar if anyone can guess who the speaker is. Socialism is a way of life, not just an economic theory. And the process of achieving socialism, we have to have good citizens. Socialism demands the highest standard of civic virtue. Does anybody know who said that? Not anyone would have panicked, so probably see who I've written down for it. No? Clement Attlee in 1948. And the Labour Party is unique because, unlike the other two main parties, national parties in the country, it was founded from the voluntary sector, essentially. The trade union movement, the Working Men's Association, the cooperative sector, it is fully embedded in the life of our communities, and that's what it's always sought to achieve. So sometimes I know, given the problems of government, and I heard Rachel Reeves on the Day programme this morning talking about some of those challenges, often in politics it can be very tempting to focus on the state as an institution, and it has an incredibly important and powerful role. But I think the Labour Party, at its best, has always recognised there is another great power in our country, and that is the power of our citizens, whether they're giving their time up voluntarily, whether they're setting up fantastic charitable organisations, or giving their money and supporting the great causes. And I'm very much struck by Attlee as a man, both a great war hero, but also someone who'd spent his life working in the East End of London as a member of our voluntary sector, trying to create better futures for the most vulnerable in our society. And when his government came in, yes, it created a National Health Service, but it also created a huge range of public institutions like the Arts Council to try to leverage philanthropy into our poorest communities, to spread the arts, culture, leisure, playing fields, sporting institutions, community centres. Labour in the post-45 government, it wasn't just about the state, it was about rebuilding communities. And I was very conscious that this conference seems to be echoing some of the challenges of that 45 government. It's great to remember that, and that's why I think this panel will hopefully be very enlightening, very interesting to you, and I would say one of the most important you'll probably hear about at this conference. So, sort of wound expectations up, Emily.
And taken half my speech.
Oh, sorry. There is only one quote from Attlee everyone uses, isn't it?
No.
So anyway, over to you, Emily, and thank you very, very much again for coming.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you everyone for being here this morning. I don't know how late you guys were. I appreciate the effort to get here on time, and I'm sure it wasn't just because. You're right. Since 1945, we have never been in such a dire economic circumstance. And where we're seeing success is not actually where the estate is expanded, but it's where the state and the philanthropy and the charities and the voluntary sector have actually worked together. And that is actually a model that's really, really helpful when we look at things like regeneration and regional inequality, because actually it is a more empowering model. One of the big things in my years as being Deputy Leader of Milton Keynes City Council is a phrase that I used quite a bit: the council is not your parent. council is not your mother. The council is not there to pick up after you. And for too many communities, that's what it's become. Even their self-worth is based on what the state has provided them. Is the council house in the estate that they live on of nice quality? Well, I get my worth from that. The council don't care about me. Why do I care about the estate? I mean, these are real quotes that you hear from people. And so throughout the work that I did on the regeneration program, everything else, it was about actually how you get the power into the hands. Now, it's really bad at because it's risky. It may not work. You're trying new things. It may go in a direction you hadn't planned. All of those sorts of things. But it is the place where the voluntary and charity sector is better than anyone else, because it's about empowering that community. There is no point in redoing everybody's houses on an estate if you're not improving health inequalities, if you're not improving job opportunities, if you're not lowering the rate of low-level depression and loneliness and anxiety. These are things that have to come alongside any effort to deal with inequalities in our society. And that's what we did on the Lakes Estate. The Lakes Estate is one of the poorest estates in the entire country. And a lot of people hear all the great stuff about Milton Keynes, how our GBA is great and all this kind of stuff. But actually, we do have some of the poorest communities because many of those first communities were about emptying the East End of London. And there was nothing done then to really help people. And so when we look at what we're doing, and this is what I love about places to be proud of. Well, places to be proud of doesn't come from an architect's design or from a council saying, I'm proud of this estate. It comes from the people that live there. And this is where I really see how that works together. Because can you imagine the council saying, well, what we're going to do to tackle loneliness is we're going to have a council-run bingo. Sounds fun, right? Nobody's going to come to that. But the reality is that's what we did in the Lakes Estate. We created this thing. It was we got some money from the ICB. We said we're going to tackle loneliness, and it was an experiment. And we said, here, we're going to give it to our leaders in our communities. And they decided to run a bingo. And has that reduced loneliness and anxiety and low-level depression? Yes. Is that something councils can afford to do on a big basis, or DWP can afford to do, or Department of Health? No. And this is where the partnership needs to come in. On top of that, what we're looking at is things like, so in rough sleeping, rough sleeping is one of my real passions, and it is one of the most complicated areas of public policy. Because it's not just about housing, it's about trauma, and it's not just about trauma, it's about self-medicating through drugs and alcohol, and all of these sorts of things. The thing that the state cannot do very well is be flexible and be individual in its approach. It really can't. It's very good at doing the same thing for everybody. We'll give everybody the same housing benefit. We'll give everybody the same access to schools. We'll give everybody. It doesn't do specialized, and it certainly doesn't do trauma-based interventions at all. But what has worked really well, again in Milton Keynes, because I love live examples, and Dan will know this from my time at NPC, I'm much more on the do than the think, is we said, right, we're going to forget all this arguing, but we're actually going to say, what can you do that we can't do, and what can we do that you can't do? And that's actually how we're the only city in the country that's reduced our number of rough sleepers in the last few years. So while the state is absolutely at its smallest level, it is actually a huge opportunity to do things differently. And at the heart of that, right back to the front, is the state is not your mum and it's not your dad. But the way you change that relationship is to have that flexibility through philanthropy, through charities, to build up and have that ability to flex into those spaces that the state is just really crap at doing and shouldn't really try.
Thank you, Emily. Brilliant. Thanks so much. And great to get, absolutely. And great to get those practical examples of what it means on the ground as well, and your own experience. Neil, over to you.
Okay, well, thanks, Andrew, and thanks to Demos and to NPC and to all of you for being here this morning. Um, Charities Aid Foundation, for those of you who are not familiar with it, the clues in the name, we're a foundation that exists to aid charities. That's all charities everywhere. And we do that in three ways. We seek to collaborate cross-sector and border to try to inspire the kind of innovation so that civil society as a whole can thrive. We partner with donors to support them to realize greater impact from their giving. And then we seek to enable charities to do more of their life-changing work with lasting benefits for all of us. What that means for us is last year we distributed £1.1 billion to several hundred thousand charities in every constituency in the UK and in more than 100 countries around the world. So why philanthropy? Well, I guess I often think that the word is actually a little bit problematic because it comes with all sorts of assumptions as to what it really speaks to. For the way that we think about it, it's really simple. It's just about giving of the resources to charitable organizations to allow them to do more great work. Whether that giving comes from high net worth individuals, it comes from corporations, or it just comes from regular everyday givers. And our belief is that no British government has ever really cracked the potential of philanthropy. And interesting that you took us all the way back to the Attlee government, Andrew. And I do think I think there is a tremendous opportunity to think about it very differently now, given the extraordinary economic and social challenges that we just heard of. There are a whole bunch of examples in other parts of the world where people are reimagining philanthropy, whether you look to Singapore or to Ireland, or the Australian Labour government has set a target to double philanthropy by 2030, and that's because they fundamentally recognise the relationship between economic development and the kind of social cohesion that we all want. That the pride that you talked about on those estates. It's really important that we never see it as a substitute or a replacement for state funding. That is not what it's about. But in terms of partnership, in terms of coming alongside and elevating and doing the kind of things that we've seen in the past, the kind of innovation, the kind of risk-taking, whether, and there's loads of established examples about how that's worked in times past, whether you look to the RNLI or the air ambulance or the hospice movement. These are really important contributions to the communities in which we all live. And I think from them comes the inspiration for how we think about mobilizing the capacity that there is, notwithstanding all of the challenges. If you look into the corporate world, if you look into the high net worth world, there is actually a significant capacity to do a lot more than we are currently managing. And given that the Prime Minister's talked about a decade of national renewal, we believe that one aspect of that renewal, it's really important that we renew our culture of giving. And in order to do that, there is a need to be very strategic about how you direct new funding to the places that matter most, that can make the greatest difference to some of the most intractable social problems. I think that there are all sorts of very specific policy interventions that we and others have put forward. Fundamentally, incentives and nudges work in terms of adjusting behaviour, but you do need a very systematic approach to how you deploying those things that are available to the government. We put forward a match first principle that we think it offers tremendous potential for additional funding to come alongside government interventions around mission-led government, initiatives around diaspora giving, where people have moved away from the locations that they feel very passionate about, but they want to support them. So diaspora in the sense of UK citizens retaining a connection with where they came from. And you've got examples like Maidstone, very much driven by local MP Tristan Hunt and others. And I'm conscious that at MPC, some of the ideas that are brought forward around charitable action zones and so forth. So I guess there's a whole range of potential that we think can be accessed and can make a really important contribution to this decade of national renewal. And I'll probably close with just a couple of helpfully free examples, which would cost the government absolutely nothing in terms of insisting that the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, require the wealth advisors to have a conversation with their clients about philanthropy. We think that's a very practical and straightforward intervention that would play an important part in nudging behaviour. And similarly, we just published our annual corporate giving report, where we've looked at what's going on with business. In the last 10 years, the FTSE 100 profits have increased by 49%, and yet the community investment component of those profits has declined by 34%. And there's a real correlation there between a change that was made to the Companies Act, where mandatory reporting of community investment public companies was removed, and we believe that would be a very simple and straightforward intervention, really, so that we can celebrate some amazing examples from some of the largest companies of their engagement and charitable giving, and really use that to inspire the rest of the business community. And if the business community across the board adhere to what it has been established as best practice, about 1% of pre-tax profit being invested in the communities from where those organisations are based, that's 5 billion a year. So that there's some serious resources that could be liberated to crowdsource government come alongside government interventions, and I think that's the challenge for all of us.
Thank you, Neil. Great. So Emily and all of us in this room, if we bump into Rachel Reeves on the way for a speech to go, we've got a few policy options we can put in the bag just ahead of that. And I'm sure we'll come on to that issue around kind of corporate partnership and philanthropy as well, because I think that's such a ripe area for change. Dan, over to you.
Thank you. Very interesting contributions. I think Emily told the story of why kind of communities, civil society is so important and can tackle things nobody else can tackle. And Neil also talking about the fact that there's sort of more potential. I guess my comments are going to be a little bit more about how government and philanthropy should target what they're doing a bit more. So we have a new ambitious government, and that is all to the good, because there is much to put right. I think, as we all know, many communities have suffered over the last decade or so, and many areas and regions have fallen behind. And there are a whole host of social challenges that this new Labour government needs to fix. Mental health, homelessness, crime, prison overcrowding, lots more, and of course growth as well, which is something I'm sure we'll hear quite a lot from Rachel Reeves later on about. And if they want to tackle them, these issues, then of course there will need to be more government funding one way or another, and that is very difficult at the minute, as we know. But also, of course, to target that support sensibly and to use that in ways that liberates and exploits the massive asset that is civil society and the charity sector. And so we've argued over the years, and feel it even more now, that we need a shift in government funding away from just building new things or tarting up the high street. This is, I think, how most of us saw the Levelling Up programme of the past, and the way they were thinking about the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and instead invest in programs that work to tackle those underlying social needs and that underpin social capital, which is a key and often underrated, and I say this as an economist, ingredient for a healthy local economy and to underpin national economic growth. And so I think alongside that kind of understanding of how important that is to solving these issues and getting growth going and solving some of the social problems that we have, we need a fundamental shift in where the support to the sector, the social sector, is going. And I mean that both in terms of government funding and also philanthropic funding. And I did a report a few years ago, which was called Where Are England's Charities, which basically showed something we probably all knew, but it got a bit tougher on the data, and people have done work since then. We're basically showing there are far more registered charities in prosperous areas than there are in deprived areas. And of course, you know, there are issues about it's only registered charities that you can have a look at, and there's lots of other stuff going on. But that basic story is probably true. And I think that needs to change if we want to get some of the communities and the regions that need a boost of all sorts of ways. We need to change that. Now, a lot of that responsibility on doing that, I think, is on philanthropy and grant makers. They need to think, where am I putting my money? Is this the right place to be putting my money? Where is the need? Am I putting it in there? And I think, you know, hopefully over the last few years, certainly some of the grant makers and foundations have thought a bit harder. And it's no good saying, well, we never get any applications from that area, that deprived area. Well, of course you don't, because nobody's got the capacity to even to get together and send off a grant application. So you've got to be active and get out there. So I think there's a lot on on philanthropy and grant makers. I've argued as well, there's a lot on bigger charities. And I've put this to quite a lot of the big charities that have branches all over the place. Have a look at your footprint. Do you have branches or whatever, particularly if you're a federated charity, in some of the more deprived areas? And if you don't, and you often won't, I mean, one of the joys of the charity sector is it's all voluntary. So if people decide to set up a sort of local Age UK and fundraise for it and all the rest of it, then it will happen. And if they don't, it won't. But the big charities need to think that they want to do some cross-subsidy. Very difficult for them. But I think there's an onus on them. But I think obviously there's also an onus on government to think about how they do this. And I think there's a number of things that they need to do, and I hope that this government will do. I mean, one is by letting charities and philanthropy into the decision-making process around delivering the government's 5 missions, because a lot of this will come out if you do have people from the social sector who are getting involved in these discussions. We think that government should invest in what we've been calling, we use different names actually, but I think it's social growth zones, and properly evaluating what's working. And I think fundamentally is that making sure that whatever resource government chooses to put into the sector goes to the areas where it is most needed. So a massive sort of weighting on deprivation and need. And that can be by using match funding to draw in philanthropy to where it is needed, or, as we've argued for rather controversially, regional variations in gift aid, so that if you want to give to a charity that is doing nice things about doing up the local pond in a prosperous area, you don't get as much a tax break if you're funding a charity doing really difficult work in a deprived area. There's all sorts of issues about that. I'm an ex-Treasury person, so I know how difficult it would be to actually do that. But the point is that whatever funding, whether it's through tax advantages or through grants, government chooses to put in should be focused on the more deprived areas. And I think a last thing government can do, I think it is going to do, is to empower local areas, particularly mayoral combined authorities more. I think our experience, I think most charities find this, is that the mayors are much more interested in thinking about the assets in their area and how they can use that to solve some of the social problems and to get growth in their communities. So the more power that is devolved down to them, I think the more you will get charities and philanthropy involved in discussions. So the last Labour government tried hard to work with the sector. I was part of all that, lucky to be part of all that. It wasn't perfect, but at least it tried. I think the sector's been largely locked out and treated with suspicion over the or so, and I hope this Labour government will really partner with the sector to the benefit of the government and society, as well as to charities and philanthropy.
Thanks very much, Dan. Now, Sunder, you asked me where you were in the batting order, and I said you were sort of night watchman, but I think actually more night hawk, I think, using the kind of Brendan and Cullen baseball analogy. So over to you to kind of conclude our comments.
Great. Thanks to Demos, MPC, Charities Aid Foundation. I'm the director of British Future, non-partisan think tank charity that looks at issues of identity. So places to be proud of is a really good, important theme to look at in terms of growth and opportunity and supporting communities. If we're taking a decade-long perspective and strategy and vision about where we'd like to be and how to make that change, I just want to also think about how we think about that long-term vision and some of the scenes we saw that happened this summer in terms of the violence, disorder, rioting, racist violence, much of it, in terms of what does that say about the challenges of places to be proud of and how we respond in a strategic way that takes us to where we want to be. In terms of what happened, 5-6 days and nights, very frightening, very visible, very scary, very fast, but quite sporadic actually. We think maybe 4,000 people took part in disorder in 35 places. A very tiny number of people, things fizzle in and fizzle out. Some terrible scenes of damage and attempts to cause harm. It stops quite quickly. It's policed quite visibly. There's an attempt overnight to challenge the argument places to be proud of, because when people come out and clean up, they're not just cleaning up because there are bricks or bits of broken glass. They're cleaning up because they want to tell a story about the place, who speaks for it, who represents it. People have rioted wearing the football shirt of the local town, and people need to pick up the litter wearing the badge of identity of the local town. It's actually a contest about who owns the place in real time. But there's also the question about what, apart from the policing and the sending the strong message, how do you get to the causes of things like that? How do you understand that, and how do you deal with that everywhere? In terms of people's attitudes to that, a scarily large number of people, thought there was something that justified going on. I mean, 85% of people didn't, but 7, 10, 12% of people said they associated more with the disorder and the violence than with the cleanup campaign. So in a way, we need a narrative for the 75, 80%, so we make sure we're not represented by those ugly scenes, but we actually need a strategy for the very hard edge everywhere of people who in a sense are rejecting the social norms of the places they live in. How do we do that? What's the partnership that does that? I think one of the big issues there is that has to be an agenda about everywhere. If we were picking risk areas where this might happen, we might have lots of factors, and we wouldn't pick Sample as a place that might face that. It's got a Labour MP now for the first time in a century, but it's one of the posher bits of Merseyside. It wouldn't be on our sort of risk list. So what happened there? Why it was the epicenter of a global event could happen anywhere in our country. So everywhere needs to think about its resilience to shock events. I think also one of the challenges of having rightly a kind of growth-first government that really knows that people's experience of economic opportunity is really important is that of course it's going to help if we get the distribution of growth and opportunity, if we get the condition of public services, if you fix how it feels, potholes and so on. That's symbolic as well as substantive of respect for places. But there's a danger maybe of lapsing into the idea if you deal with the socioeconomic, then the community relations look after themselves. And I think what you really need is intentional action on both fronts, because it's not just the conditions of the roads that makes you wonder what's going on in the mosque or the synagogue. It's about your perceptions of the people you share your town and your city with, your sense of who they are, how well you know them, how well your kids know them, and we can do things about that as well. So I think this is a sort of roles and responsibilities job, and I think there's an analogy, Dan, to what you're saying, that you need to level up philanthropy and not do it. That is also changing society, that it will grow and strengthen in the places that have got it, and it needs more help and intentional capacity in the places that haven't got it. And there's what is the job of government? The basic foundations, knowing what we measure, but what is the job of foundations? I think having that map, we know how to sort of audit equal opportunities. We should be auditing those sorts of relationships of confidence, indifference, fear, prejudice, knowing where the challenge is. And here's a challenge, I think, to this agenda. That I think the hyperlocal is a really, really good thing. If we want equal opportunity, break down the barriers, mutual respect, the relationships between us, a sense of share of voice everywhere, then Emily, have you found that the going very, very local really works? People really have confidence at that level. But I think we need to bridge up from that, because if we don't just want the bonding but the bridging, we've really got to think about 4 and 5 miles across cities and towns, and especially 10 to 12 miles outside of a place of change to the people looking in at change but not experiencing contact, or right out to coastal communities and so on, where people are receiving that information on the news about a changing society but are going to have much less experience on it. So I think at the local level, the places we meet and mix that bring us together with the people we already know and the people we don't really matter. But I think there's a real opportunity for city, region government, national government and philanthropy to think about who can extend the contact, the confidence to people who wouldn't have it, and how can we intentionally invest in that while dealing with economics and opportunity as well.
Thank you very much. Some really, really great points there. I'm going to just ask a few questions to the panel here, and then we're going to come quickly as we can over to you, because that's where the conversation will begin with the Q&A. Emily, I know it's incredibly early days, but do you get that sense when talking to your colleagues and the ministers and so on, as they kind of integrate those challenges, they recognise the value and potential of this, of both philanthropy and of the kind of civil society sector? Or do you think there's still, you know, given the scale of the challenges we face, is there more work for us to do amplify that voice and make sure that, as Dan said, you know, as we're thinking about addressing some of these kind of key policy challenges, that we're not doing that in a way that doesn't tap into the resource and the expertise that you know, philanthropists, foundations, civil society have?
I think absolutely, when you look at the government's focus within those missions on prevention, they absolutely recognise that there is a role to be played here. I think there is still that fear, and this is partly due to the behaviour of governments and charities, I would challenge, that if they bring too many into that discussion, what the discussion will end up being is, and how much money are you giving us? And how much money are you giving us? And the reality is that's not partnership then. And so this is where we really, again, we need to say, right, we are equal partners in the room. We share this mission. What are the bits that we can do? What is the kind of philanthropy we can leverage? And government can say, here's the bits that we can do to achieve this mission, and how do we work alongside each other? Because the reality is there isn't a lot of money. There isn't a lot of money. So we do need to do some of the things that Neil's talked about, is how are we ambitious like Australia and say, actually what we want to do is create a system where we can double philanthropy. And what we may want to do without making the tax system too complicated is how do we then delineate it to places and missions and make sure that that's coming alongside, because the you know, these missions are going to cost a lot of money, but they're also going to cost a lot of social capital. They're also going to be things that we have to do that make people change behaviors. We're challenging behaviors, as Sunder talked about. And actually, again, there's a lot in those missions, particularly around the prevention side, the social cohesion side, which are really not best delivered by state institutions, and much better delivered in that ground up, even if it is building those bridges on a wider basis. And I absolutely agree with Sunder. This is where the mayors have a really interesting role, because they have that view on a scale.
Thank you. Great point. And I think your point about prevention as well is it does feel like a particularly good opportunity for the sector to play to its strengths. Neil, you mentioned the corporate giving angle, but a wonderful product that CAF also does in terms of research is your sort of overview of the UK Giving Index and kind of international CAF as well. And I remember when it started, we were sort of in the top 10 regularly in terms of countries around the world. And it now feels like over the years we are falling behind, it feels like, or seeing a reduction in levels of giving in the kind of countries as a whole. I think the kind of culture of Britain is that we're very proud of our culture of giving and philanthropy, I think, but clearly there seems to be some barriers emerging in terms of expressing that, whether that's through giving of voluntary time, which, you know, the repeated studies have shown people are volunteering less than they used to, or giving of money. What do you think is underpinning that? What do you think government can do in that spirit of partnership to try to create the most enabling environment possible so that everyone can be a philanthropist, whether it's by time or by money?
Well, I think two things can be true at the same time. So the UK remains an incredibly generous country. We are very lucky that you mentioned some of our research. So our annual UK giving research highlighted that this year things have gone up to about 13.9 billion. Right? Now, 13.9 billion is a really, really chunky number that has a massive effect. And I think it's really important to celebrate the unusual who have generated that. But one of the things that our research is highlighting is, although the absolute number continues to grow, the proportion of our society from whence it came is declining. And in the very long run, that's a really troubling fact. And just to put some numbers around that, sort of 10 years ago, when asked the question of have you donated your time or cash, or helped a stranger in need in the last 30 days. 10 years ago, the answer to the cash question was 7% of people, and it's now 67%. When it comes to volunteering, it's dropped back from 32% to 26%. And when it comes to all measures, there is an established pattern over a long period of time that was well established before COVID and has accelerated since. And we're seeing that in relative terms. So it is, I never want to get to the point where all the people who are giving their time, their talent, and so forth, we don't recognize and celebrate that and use that to inspire the rest of us where we can to become engaged, because we all have a stake in reversing some of those trends. I think the new government, I think, has listened, and I think that argument about how do you reverse that decline, I think is what I know that many are wrestling with. But with watching insanity, keep doing the same thing and expect the result to be different. And the convergence of philanthropic money, social investment money, and responsible business money needs to be directed, and it needs a strategy in order to do that, in order to achieve some of the things Dan was saying. And that's a really easy thing to do, and ridiculously, really, really easy thing to say, and a very, very difficult thing to do, given the nature of the way our system is hardwired. But the only place that you start is by acknowledging it for what it is, and to begin the work of the multiplicity of interventions, because the range of things that need to happen is incredibly broad. There's some really, really nerdy technical things that I could bore you with about importing charitable remainder trusts from the US into the UK, but I won't. But these are some of the things that when you talk to philanthropists, there's a lot of cynicism about philanthropy. There's a lot of cynicism about motivation and greenwashing, and we have the privilege of working with a very large proportion, and the vast majority of these individuals are vested in their communities and vested in their kids' future, and they want to find more effective ways to give more, and for that giving to translate into a real social difference to people's lives. And I think the reset that needs to happen, a once in a generation government change is a very rare opportunity to actually undertake that kind of fundamental reset.
Absolutely excellent. I think your point about it, kind of having that clear strategy is really important. Dan, obviously New Philanthropy Capital Chief Executive, but as you mentioned, hinted at, you also had a previous life as advisor and support to the kind of new Labour government. Are there any lessons they could be learning from that period? I'm thinking about things like New Deal for Communities and the compacts and other areas. There was a lot of engagement in trying to leverage the resource of the sector and help with that regeneration. Anything that we should be learning from that period?
No, interesting question, Andrew. I mean, I think the big difference, and I see it happening again. I always had to be careful since I worked for the Labour government, last Labour government. I can see it through rose tinted glasses, and I've forgotten all the things that went wrong. I remember the things that went wrong.
Surely nothing went wrong, Dan.
And of course, nothing did go wrong. But the whole attitude to the voluntary sector and so on was much more open, and I think that's very important. I always remember. So I was a special advisor in the Department of Trade and Industry in '97, and we opened the doors to the NGOs that worked on trade policy, with trade policy, for instance, and they'd not been inside the Whitehall for a long time, and to the shock of our officials, they knew a hell of a lot more that was going on in the trade negotiations than our officials did, and that's important to bring people in, and I think the same thing's happening again. I think the doors are open. Doesn't mean government will do everything in the charity sector. You've got your particular mission, you're passionate about it, you think government should devote all of its time and efforts to this thing, and of course government's got to balance all these different things and so on. But the voice should be there. I mean, I've given an example, I mean, I hope it doesn't change, but the last government, if a charity sort of attacked it about something, you would find some briefing appearing in various newspapers and stuff like that. Now, to fuel payments, which Age UK are leading, and I'm sure government ministers, privately, it's not very helpful. But that hasn't been. This is an evil charity with bad motivations or anything like that. It is legitimate for Age UK to campaign like that. Government will listen to them. Probably won't do what they want. But I think that is a much more healthy relationship. I think you can codify some of these things. We had the compact. I know there's talk at the moment about a sort of covenant or something like that with the charitable sector. These things help. I certainly found those sort of things helpful. Even if all it does is guarantee you a meeting, let's say every 6 months, with the leaders of the charity sector, with a bunch of secretaries of state, that filters down the department. Secretary of State's got to go to this thing. They better say something. So we better make sure we've done something. Somebody better be in charge of it. All that stuff helps massively. So I think we can do things. And then, as you say, Andrew, I think the other thing is some of these, that when you do get down to sort of trying to have regional regeneration, and you talk about New Deal for Communities, and there was lots of other things, including sort of New Deal for young people, all these sort of things, or even when we had the financial crash and we brought in employment schemes, Future Jobs Fund was largely sort of driven by the voluntary sector, not top-down sort of contracts and so on. So if that attitude comes through, it's good for the government, it's good for the charity sector, and also I think helps philanthropy, because I think philanthropists often ask us, certainly the ones we work with, where should I put my money? Where is the need? If I put it into there, will government come alongside? Will they learn from me? So if you get all those relationships right, I think it helps everybody, and I hope that's what's going to happen.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to get that perspective and some of that kind of lessons learned. I guess, I mean, it's interesting. I asked Neil about the culture of kind of giving and philanthropy, but if you look in a lot of our communities, I'm thinking particularly around the Muslim community as well, there's a fantastic kind of tradition of philanthropy and rich giving, and a lot of kind of church and faith-based organisations across our communities doing great work. Do you think, in terms of our identity, philanthropy and that kind of culture of service, and Keir Starmer was talking about that a few times, actually, kind of bringing that back, is that a way to kind of try to create that kind of bonding and bridging capital you're talking about? And is it possible to turn the page on perhaps what you might say is a kind of great period of individualism we've seen probably since the sort of 80s and 90s, which is maybe seeped into how we think about our relationships both with our communities and the state, but also kind of on issues like philanthropy and so on?
Yeah, there's some potential in that. I mean, the thing that improves people's sense of the people they share a society with, who are different to them, is meaningful contact, especially over time, especially in conditions that of relative equality rather than of unequal status. That's kind of common sense, and that's why we see big progress across the generations in our societies, you have more meaningful contact from an earlier age. Now, the contact and the confidence is unevenly spread by age, by geography, because populations are spread, by time and capacity to get involved in things, people in faith groups. But there's a thing we actually slightly underestimate as well, which is that sort of images, imagine contact, seeing people doing something is not the sort of thing. So actually, you know, sort of Muslim-led groups or faith groups turning up in a flood in an area to support people that aren't Muslim in Cumbria. It's the sort of thing that is going to the sort of least diverse thing. Say, oh, you turned up, it's nice you did that. Why did you do that? And I say, well, we did it because of our faith, or we did it because you wanted to, and so on. That is creating an impression of contact, which is kind of cutting against the other thing. Now, another way, sort of faith-based engagement could be very siloed, or, you know, the majority community is becoming very secular while the minorities are more faithful. So if you do it all as kind of faith-to-faith engagement, you'll get the people who already do it, and you won't get the people who don't do it. So you should be trying to sort of link that up into sort of, you know, sports clubs, libraries, you know, communities, etc. So at the moment, actually, if you do participate in a faith-based congregation, you'll be given loads of chances to sort of engage in different things. And you might not, as a kind of secular agnostic individual, know where those opportunities are as much. So it's quite interesting, I think, as to how you could bridge out of that as well. So I think it does work as long as it doesn't stay too silent.
Completely. Well, some great contributions there. Thank you for that. Now I'm going to open the floor to some questions. Yes, is there a microphone? I believe there is. To amplify voices. So there's somebody here, and then someone there, and then somebody there.
Good morning, my name's Rebecca Mansell. I'm deaf, so I'm using my VSL interpreter today to voice for me. I'm the Chief Executive of the British Deaf Association. I also have another hat. So I'm an elected trustee at the Chartered Institute of Fundraising. So today, thank you all for your contributions. I've really, a lot of points you raised very relevant to us. So you talk about culture and identity. As deaf people, we have deaf culture and deaf identity. We have our own language. So you talk about based. We are based everywhere. People are based all over the UK. We are and dispersed across the UK. So you talk about philanthropy linked to the States. We have really struggled as a community. We finally have our British Sign Language recognised in law 2 years ago, so very recently, and at last our language is finally ratified. However, there is no state investment in British Sign Language across the UK, no national framework for sign language. Yet research shows the benefit of bilingualism for deaf children who use sign language and their visual hearing have a best outcome for achievement. So, for example, the children who use English alongside Welsh. So why don't we have that for British Sign Language? My question for you today is, how can we encourage the states to contribute to the development of British Sign Language? We spend thousands of pounds on delivering our charitable sign language classes at home, but the government won't spend their money on that. How do we do that and create a national programme? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great question. Seb and then Don.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Seb Heslop from Access to the Foundation for Social Investment. And it's great to have a conversation about philanthropy. But for me, I think it's really important that we ground that in the kind of broader funding ecology of the whole sector. And obviously a really significant part of the sector's income also comes from trading, enterprise, what you might call social enterprise, if you think of it as an activity rather than a thing. And government support for social enterprise is also kind of critical. And there are a couple of things that really are important, I think, as we think how to maximise the sector's resources. I mean, one key point is that there are lots of activity that civil society organisations do that can generate income. And it's really important that the philanthropy that's available is going to the areas that can't generate income or where that activity needs to be subsidised. So there's a kind of targeting point that's really important. Clearly, social investment is part of that geographical spread. What we see through social supporting community scale organisations is a very strong correlation between that finance going to the absolute most deprived communities. So in terms of targeting resources for the communities that need it most, there's a really area, this is an area where government is already spending money and can spend some of that money more smartly. Dormant assets, for example, help to catalyse a lot of that social investment, leveraging in private finance into places private finance can't otherwise move. We've seen quite a stall on the dormant asset flow. About 18 months ago, there was a problem determining where that money should go, and nothing has yet happened in terms of the next round of dormant assets. So I think really important that government starts to mobilise that money, but also starts to think about other parts of government expenditure, for example, things like the community ownership funds that have been in TLG, how we use these resources together with private finance to really help to support the flow of capital into charities and social enterprises, not using grants where grant alone isn't the right tool, but using the government subsidies in really smart ways to catalyse private investment. And finally, for foundations, thinking about how their grant making helps to build the capacity of the sector to earn income, boost their own resilience where that is possible. It's obviously not possible everywhere, but maximising that spread of resources is really, I think, the way in which we can make sure the sector has the most resilience going forward.
Thanks very much. Dom, did you say? Oh, no. Yeah, fine, and we can come back to it. Sorry.
Hello there, Andrew Lennox from Guide Dogs. I'm also here with my Shaping the Future of Volunteering hat on, which I'm a co-chair. Just one of three things. I'm going to start with the definition. Second is observation, and the third one's a question to go to yourselves to build on some points that Neil made earlier. First one is definition, philanthropy. I was looking at one, I came up with a really useful one, which is the giving of time, talent, and treasure, which I thought was a really interesting one, especially the talent being the middle one. So then I get to the observation, which is I was with a philanthropist last Thursday, and his team are time poor in this world, and we've seen this through the points Neil was making earlier regarding the drop in volunteering we've seen post-COVID and the move towards micro-volunteering. People are time poor, so organisations are more willing to use time that they have for people to volunteer in work, but using their talents to, I know, help you with an issue with your website rather than standing outside Sainsbury's with a collection bucket. And then we get to the third one, which is around the fact that last year there were 200 million hours of corporate time that was donated to charities that went unused. That's 68,000 person days of work per day, 365 days a year that were not used. So to Neil's point about the having a strategy, I would implore that whatever strategies come up with, we look at not just the treasure, but actually how we can use that lost opportunity of time and talent to support that social society piece, because there's so much that corporates could bring to the charity and social enterprise world if we can leverage those 200 million hours. Thank you.
Some great questions. I guess so. One, thank you very much. Around kind of, I guess, we focused as a conversation on place to be proud of, but it's also as well, and obviously, the deaf community, thinking about how we can kind of look at philanthropy and leveraging kind of partnership in the state philanthropy and those communities which aren't necessarily place-based, but are obviously based everywhere. Very good points from Seb about trading and social enterprise and marketing, and then another great point around time and talent and kind of maximising those contributions. I'm just going to go through the panel. You don't have to answer all the questions, otherwise we're here all day, but just any kind of quick points you want to pick up on questions you think are particularly pertinent. I might reverse the order actually, Sunder, because you've been last a couple of times. So I'm going to bring you in first and then come back around kind of that way. So yeah, any thoughts you want to pick up from those questions?
Just on the sign language point, I think there's been really important progress making it a cultural norm. I know you'd want to put lots of structures in place to sustain that, but I think you see it across the generations. You get down to primary school age. I saw this with my children, that the sense that everybody can do something about that because it's good and inclusive for the people who need to use it, I think isn't a thing we had when I was. You have that, and it's things like CBBS and so on that are promoting that as a norm. So I think that kind of thing, and it being in the House of Commons as well, gives you a new setting that everybody can have a stake in the issue, not just the people who directly need it.
Great. Dan, thoughts on those questions?
Yeah, I mean, Seb's point about kind of other revenue streams and so forth, clearly important. I mean, it's interesting, what exactly, how does government encourage that? There's obviously the debate about dormant assets. an ex-Treasury person, I would be very surprised if they're not trying to think how they want to use those dormant assets, and whatever the last government said may not be what the next government wants to do, but we shall see. And I think there's a more general point as well about, you know, where have the philanthropists gone, the high net worth philanthropists at least, and have a lot of them and they get much more interested in impact investing and so on, which is to some extent, it can mean all sorts of things, but to some extent is investing in private companies that seem to be doing something socially good, like renewables or childcare or whatever. And is that where some of the money's going? Is that a bad thing or not? But we certainly find that with working with the sort of philanthropists that we do, that they're much more interested, a lot of, particularly younger ones, much more interested in impact investing. It's more in the private sector over social good. We are dubious about whether they actually are creating as much social good as they say, and we're trying to do work on that. But the last thing on volunteering, I mean, I don't know, I tend to be a skeptic that you can pull levers that change volunteering. If you look at sort of historical trends in volunteering, amounts of time of people doing it, they don't really change that much. We get a blip when we had the Olympics, for instance, and it went up and everybody said this will be a new era of volunteering. No, we'll never go back. And of course the grant again and so on. So I don't know exactly what you can do. I mean, been doing some work for DCMS, which I hope will see the light of day because it was done before the election. We're waiting to see whether they publish it. But that you know, partly that's looking at this issue of micro volunteering and digital ways, which a lot of charities tried during COVID. There was a lot of good work done by a number of volunteering heavy charities, making it easier for people who are, as people have said, time poor, don't want to volunteer in the same way. I'm always struck by the story. I don't think it's the current, I think it was the previous chief executive of the Girl Guides, but maybe Matt could say about from the Scouts as well. But in the old days, how did the staff, the volunteers that ran the local guide pack, how did they go? Well, they went to the brownies and guides in their town. They stayed in the town. They didn't go away. They were to some extent not working or not working that much, and they became the guiders. Now, you know, they will study, they will go to university, they probably won't come back to the town. If they do come back to the town, they'll be working full time. They haven't got the time. You have to change your model of volunteering because the world is changing. And the sector is doing quite a lot of that, but a lot of it doesn't do it very well. I know I'm on the board of St Mungo's, talking about rough sleeping earlier, and you know, the strategy for trying to get volunteers involved is very difficult. And we've seen a very big drop in volunteering since COVID, actually, and trying to get it all going again. The habits got lost as well. But I mean, it is a vital thing, and people love volunteering. In fact, the best evidence about volunteering is it's great for the volunteers. There's a little bit less evidence how good it is in delivering some of the outcomes, but it's great thing to do.
Thanks, Neil. Any kind of bits of the questions you want to go?
Yeah, just as Dan was talking about COVID, sparked a thought in my mind. We were very influenced by some of the things that happened during COVID, and specifically when I think about those extraordinary times, and this was absolutely tactical. There was nothing strategic about this whatsoever. In the first few weeks of the pandemic, CAF found some money from some philanthropists. It was about £5 million to get cash out to charities very, very quickly, bluntly to stop very small charities falling over in those first few weeks of the first lockdown. Having done so, it then went out to its corporate partners, in this case, the Association of British Insurers, a membership organisation, some 37 for-profit financial institutions who wanted to do their bit and ponied up 84 million quid. And then very quickly thereafter, CAF, together with ABI, engaged with government and its community match challenge, which is one component of the Chancellor's 750 million intervention for the charity sector. And all of a sudden, we took 20 million of that ABI money, and DCMS matched it with another 20 million. All of a sudden, we had 110 million quid to do something with, to support organisations in that context to survive, adapt, and thrive. And I guess that experience of all that money supporting several tens of thousands of organisations through different phases and manifestations really informed a lot of our thinking. And our view about this need for a strategic approach is to reverse the logic and say, at a government level, institutionalise match funding where you want to achieve execution in a mission-led government, then overlay the responsible business to get corporations to come in behind it, then overlay philanthropists, and all of a sudden you then have a coalition, a commingling, what Seb was talking about, which is different sources of money from different places, creating the resources to do something interesting and ultimately impactful. And we certainly believe that the way you break out of this slightly silo thinking, whether government or the philanthropy silo or the social investment silo or the corporate silo, is by building structures into decision making that allows some of that cross-pollination and that collaboration to happen far more naturally and systemically than has been the case until now.
That's a great point. Emily, unfortunately, I think we're running out of time, so we won't be taking more questions, but just, yes, your kind of thoughts on those questions, and then we'll wrap this up.
Yeah, I mean, fantastic points from the rest of the panelists and fantastic questions. I'm a big supporter of children growing up bilingual. I grew up English and French. I think every child should have the opportunity to grow up bilingual. I also have heard some amazing stories about you teaching people with early onset of dementia BSL as a way of keeping that bit of the brain active. And I think there's so much exciting opportunity, and it would be great if BSL was one of the languages my children had on offer in terms of their language choices at school. That's a personal opinion. That's not government policy, just to be clear. But I think it's there is so much evidence, as you said. There's so much evidence. I'm skeptical of corporate time giving if it's done on one-off basis. So we're just going to go and paint that. We're going to go do that. Where I've seen it work really well, and where I think we should absolutely be encouraged, is long-term partnerships. So people going back to the same place and the same organization and developing those relationships, and even better when it's done in a place-based way. And that gets quite exciting. The other thing that I think is really good when we talk about time, talent, and treasure is, and this is again something that's much better done by the voluntary sector, is things like how you access that talent. So that talent might be hairdressing. We have a hairdresser that comes in weekly to cut anybody who's at risk of rough sleeping or who just doesn't have the money for a hairdresser. Those kinds of long-term partnerships, always on a Tuesday, always at the old bus station in Milton Keynes. It's those sorts of relationships that give both the partners in that relationship something that they feel committed to, something that works, something that builds the understanding. And I really struggle with these one-off, we're going to go and paint something for the days. I just don't think, I think those people that painted feel very good leaving, but actually what impact has it really had? And I don't really have a problem with the social investment versus charitable giving, as I think you need the whole range. Social investment, by its very nature, is longer term. Now, where that becomes a bit of like greenwashing, or I'm investing in renewables, and actually really how much is it? That's where, quite frankly, we need to be a lot clearer. But when it's talking about a long-term partnership in a deprived area to create opportunities for young people at risk of knife crime, fantastic. Fantastic. Right, and then if you're creating a social enterprise, or to create that is what we need. When we talk about having knife crime, when we talk about tackling knife crime, there's a whole section in that is about these diversionary activities that need to happen. Youth hubs are not just that old let's go and colour and that kind of stuff. It is about that partnership and creating those opportunities for those young people. And that's really, again, coming back to the prevention side, that's where I see the huge potential in the missions. And quite frankly, the sector is much better at delivering that than the state.
Well, brilliant note to end on. And thank you very much to all of our panelists who I think have really provided some great perspectives, and to you in the audience for some great questions. I started with a quote from one great former Prime Minister, so I thought I'd end with another one. Dan will probably have written this, maybe potentially. But it is, our values are the right ones for this age: the power of community, solidarity, and the collective ability of individuals to work together to further their interests. That was Tony Blair speaking a decade or so ago about what he thought this new Labour government could achieve, working in partnership with the voluntary sector and philanthropy. And I think what we heard today is that there are so many opportunities and such a kind of a strong base to work with, but we could be achieving even more if we can get that strong kind of partnership and relationship between the state, philanthropy, communities on the ground. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your conference and have a great day.
Oh, fantastic.
Thank you so much.